Hello, everybody. Um, Today, I would like to talk about my attempt at applying machine learning to understand lithium-ion cells. Here are the points I want to hit today. First, I want to give an introduction to lithium-ion batteries and the importance of predictions in that space. Then I want to present an approach to incorporate prior knowledge in machine learning models, especially when we apply them to scientific data. Third, I want to discuss some results and how you can interpret your results to learn something about your domain-specific knowledge. And finally, I want to go over software architecture that makes this possible and give you links to the open source resources that are available to you if you're interested. I'm going to go pretty fast and pretty high level, but I'm hoping that some of the things I'm saying will intrigue you and you're going to ask questions about the underlying details. So please feel free to ask questions. Let's start with the introduction. Lithium-ion cells are a device to store energy, and they store energy densely and cheaply, which makes them a great candidate for completely electrifying transportation. And they're also a okay/good candidate for completely replacing energy generation by renewable sources while keeping the grid robust and reliable. So hopefully now you're interested in this field. And the question is, assuming that you have a background in coming up with prediction models, machine learning, etc., where should you start in order to maximize your effectiveness? And I think you should start with the questions that are asked in the process of doing research on lithium-ion batteries, where the answer takes the longest time to obtain, or the most resources to obtain. And in a nutshell, I think this question is, how will a battery's performance degrade over its lifetime? And it's pretty hard to see why it takes a long time to get this answer. It's because batteries degrade over years. So let me go through some an example here. Here are 5 different cells plotted in different colors, and we charge and discharge each cell over and over again, and we count the number of times we do this. That's called the cycle number, plotted on the x-axis here. And then for each discharge of the battery, we count the total capacity that was extracted during that discharge, and that's what we call discharge capacity on the y-axis. And as you can see, as time progresses, this capacity goes down, and eventually the cell will reach a point where it's no longer useful because it lost too much of its initial discharge capacity. And here's why this type of data is difficult. But first, is there a way for me to have a pointer? Can you see my laser pointer?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, so let's say you just have measured the first few cycles, and you want to do a prediction for what's going to happen in the long term. Well, given that initially these three cells, the green, purple, and yellow, look very similar, you might assume they have very similar degradation over their lifetime. But in fact, the green one is the first to go, and the yellow one is the last to go in the set. And you know, the blue one is second last to go, yet it looks like it's going to go first. So you can't really just do a simple extrapolation here. Okay, so we have this this thing that we want to answer. How long does it take for the battery to no longer be useful? And here's a simple proof of concept that it's possible to do these types of predictions. So here's a simple measurement you can do, and it doesn't take that many cycles. It's just the initial 16 cycles. And basically, you compute the amount of, I should say, you measure the amount of charge that you put inside the battery during charge, and the amount of charge that you extract during discharge, and the ratio is called the Coulombic efficiency. And you can see that in terms of the rank of the cell, this simple measurement explains perfectly the ranking of the lifetime. So if you do this the very naive and time-consuming way, getting the answer could take years. If you have some clever experiment and some understanding of what causes degradation, you can get a similar answer in much less time, for example, in less than a month. And basically, what we are interested in here is to make a quantitative model to do these predictions. And aspirationally, what we would really like is to be able, given the description of what a battery is, what is its design, its blueprint, what molecules did you put in it, what materials, to estimate the lifetime without doing experiments, because that's the ultimate reduction in the time it takes to do these assessments, from years to instantaneous. Okay, so now that we're done with the introduction, I want to present the approach that I've taken in this research to incorporate some prior knowledge in machine learning models. And to summarize it in one sentence, it's basically you try to write down equations that describe the perfect model, and in some places you get stuck and you don't know what's exactly the right equation, and in such cases you use a neural network. So in more details, the main points is that you try to identify simple mechanisms for which you have good intuition and describe them with variables that for which you have good intuition. And then you write equations relating these variables to each other and relating the variables you've come up with the observed data. And then each of these variables becomes some neural network. And so that's one way to include the structure. You just have the structure in which these neural networks are connected. And then the second important feature of this approach is that if you know some properties, some relationship between the variables, you can convert this property into some incentives that you will optimize for during the training alongside minimizing the error of reconstruction of your data. So here's what it looks like when you lay down the variables and give them names and try to connect them together in the case of lithium-ion cells. Here we have some key dependencies. As you've seen in the previous graph, the cycle number is an important variable. You could also use time here. And eventually what we want to predict is capacity. And every time you measure capacity, there are some immediate conditions of observation. For example, what current did you use during the discharge? That's going to influence the capacity. Furthermore, during a single discharge, you will measure multiple capacities because you will record the capacity for different voltages. So the voltage at which you measure will be another input. So those are kind of immediate conditions of observation. And then you have two other variables which are very important. One of them is the sum of all the actions you've performed on the cell. Over its lifetime, what usage did it experience? So that's the cycling history. And finally, you have the design of the cell, what it's made of, what electrode was it made of, what electrolyte. So all the theoretical description that you used to construct this cell, I call this the blueprint. And it's a bit challenging to deal with because we don't necessarily, in the model, we don't have a direct observation of all of these things. But anyway, let's assume for now that we have this variable. And the approach boils down to coming up with some intermediate variables, such as impedance and shift. And these variables are produced by these dependencies by a neural network. But then the way these variables interact with each other to produce the observed quantity, that's mostly by equations you can write down. In some cases, you will still have some neural networks in there. But that's the basic approach, and I call it the naive structure approach. So let's look at some results and discuss what they mean. One thing that's a bit challenging here, let me move this to here, is that the predictions or the output of the model are very high dimensional. Here are some ways in which they have many dimensions. First of all, there's a dependence on cycle numbers. So the data occurs at different cycles. Here the data are the dots, they're the real data, and the lines are the model. So you have different cycle numbers, and then you have different colors. Each color represents a specific type of cycle, which has different observation conditions. Here, the main effect is as you go down, the cell was discharged faster and faster. And I'm kind of skipping over a few details. For example, we also have a dependency on voltage that I'm not showing here. So anyway, these models' outputs are very highly dimensional, and so the model can fail to capture the signal and the data in many different ways. That's why we use visualization to assess the performance and understand what's going on. Along with this primary prediction, there are the internal variables of the model that are the kind of direct inputs into our equations. And here, these variables are shown, but they're not doing anything very physical. They're doing their own nonsensical thing, but the predictions are still coming out okay. So this sort of tells us that the equations we used did not limit the ability of the model to capture the data too much. There's also another point here, which is that we not only have some discharge data to reproduce, but we have some charge data. And if you look at the equations, which I don't have time to do just now, you see that the model does not do these predictions independently. So it's still able to reproduce most of the signal over these many channels, which are not independent. And this increases our confidence that our model is mostly correct. But there are some problems. So I'm going to go into the problems. So here's another cell for which the blueprint is exactly the same in the model. So if you have a function and you give it the same input, it's going to produce the same output. But the experiments that we have for these two cells have different outcomes. Namely, this one shows rapid degradation after about cycle 3000. And this is interesting. One way to solve this is simply to put more information in the blueprint. And in this particular case, there's a straightforward quantity that if you put it in the blueprint, it allows you to distinguish between these two cells, and basically you can capture this degradation here. But more generally, this might become a problem depending on what you're trying to do. Another thing that we noticed was that some axioms of the physics-based model are brittle, and the more you write equations, the more you try to dig deep in the structure and specify things, the more you can make mistakes, or you can come up with things that are approximately correct most of the time, but they're not quite what you want. And this does not interact well with having neural networks in the process. So the current approach is basically in order to retain good performance and remove the limitations of the axioms, we kind of flip things around. And basically, instead of building the prediction of the observed quantity by composing little pieces that are inspired by physics and connecting them with equations, we just have a single black box which predicts the observations, and then we recover the intuitive kind of intermediate quantities as a function of the black box. So we kind of flip things around, and this is a more flexible approach. And then you can learn a bunch of things about how your various the properties of your equations interact when you look at these things. So for example, these plateaus, they don't have like physical underpinnings. they're just they come about by the weird interaction of different specification of the problems. And this is very useful to understand better what your physical equations actually do. It's a little bit like paying a very smart person to desperately try to misunderstand what you wrote in order to solve a problem more easily. And there's another obvious problem with the current state of affairs, which is that because you have such a high dimensional output, and because you have so much dependency on complicated things, it's kind of hard to build a good training and test split, because you have many directions in which you want to generalize properly. For example, you would like to be able to generalize to different types of cycles, in this case represented by colors, that you have not encountered during training. You would like to extrapolate properly beyond, like when the data stops, you would like to do a good job after. If you have the same cell, but you expose it to very different conditions over its lifetime, it's going to behave differently. So generalizing with respect to cycling history is important. And obviously, if you have a different cell, a different blueprint, it's going to do something different. And there are different ways in which you can change a blueprint. For example, if you have a blueprint that has a mixture of two molecules which you have measured in your data set, and then you want to generalize to a different mixture, but it's still the same molecules, that's what I call a small blueprint change, a little bit akin to interpolation. But you also have like larger blueprint changes where you ask what happens if you have this new molecule which was not in the training set. And characterizing all of this is going to be challenging. Finally, I just want to mention that when you have a high-dimensional output, some bits of information about the predictions are more important than others, and they're not necessarily the ones that are captured in the naive error metric. So for example, here you have like 10,000 numbers, and none of these numbers is exactly the cycle at which this rapid degradation starts, but that's a very important number to be able to predict. So making sure that not only the full predictions are okay, but also that some high-level bits that you can extract from this prediction, they should also generalize properly. Similarly, with the unobserved physical quantities, you can think of those as well in terms of kind of higher level bits from these predictions. And those should generalize properly. So we're almost done. I just want to quickly describe the software that makes this research possible and where you can get your hands on it. So the basic architecture is you have a bunch of files which contain this data, and the files have file names, which you have to associate with a little bit of metadata. For example, you have to know which cell it's talking about, where the data contained in that file lives with respect to other files for that same cell. And you also need to know some of the cycling history variables that are not inside the file, for example, temperature. And then you have a bunch of those files for the same cell, and though this data gets processed and linked to the cell ID. And on the other side, you need to be able to organize the cell blueprint. So what is the blueprint? Well, a cell is made from a dry cell, which is the cell without electrolyte, and some electrolyte. And the dry cell itself is made of an anode, a cathode, a separator, some geometric information, it kind of keeps going. So you keep track of all this structure, you make it searchable, and you also keep track of it in the machine learning model. All of this code is open source. It can be used by a different experimental lab to analyze their own data, to process their own data files and have some good visualization and extract some information from it. And it can also be used to compile a data set for machine learning. And then there's a second part, which is the machine learning part of the software. I want to thank my student, Harvey Wang. And I want to thank myself also. But anyway, so we're a team of two, and we're working really hard to make this awesome software that people want to use. Next week, we will release some video guides to help interested researchers getting started with different aspects of the software. And there's a small compiled data set with anonymized metadata, which is available upon email request to me. And the goal over time is to release bigger and bigger data sets based on published data from the lab in order for different teams working on modeling to be able to come to a consensus as to like which model is better and like what are some good aspects of each model, etc. And we also want to make sure that other labs who collect the data are able to use the software to analyze their own data, use good models on that data. And similarly, we want to let other labs who want to make better models from our data do the same. So here are some references. Many of them are about things I kind of skipped over in the talk, but I'm happy to talk about them. And I want to thank you, and I'm happy to take questions. That's it.
Does anyone have any question for Sam? I think there is a question on the chat by Randolph. The question is, has this informed you on, wait, is this? No, yeah.
So I think at the moment, this method of looking at the data has been useful because sometimes you just want to compare, let's say, 3 cells that you made that you controlled for specific variables, and because of noise in the data or the fact that it's kind of hard to really have the full lifetime of the cell, so you only have partial data, it's kind of hard to make a fair comparison between the two. And you can use this approach to get a version of the data that is like doesn't have the noise in it. And this is helpful to understand the impact of a given variable. But I think in order to really inform the design, you need to push the model and the data set to have, I would say, on the order of thousands, if not tens of thousands of cells. It's harder to do if you just have 100 cells, which is what we're working with during this presentation. But scaling up to 1,000 cells and then 10,000 cells is on the roadmap for May and June. So. Any other question?
So if there is no other question, let's everyone thank Sam for the great presentation. And